Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jacqueline Harris, and I'd like to welcome you to ACYPL's first ever virtual town hall. Today marks the launch of our virtual town hall series, which will examine several issues that alumni in our network are facing both across the United States and around the world. Before I turn things over to our speakers, on behalf of our team here at ACYPL, I'd like to thank all of our alumni, partners, nominees, and friends for the outpouring of support during this unprecedented time. COVID-19 is impacting all of us in different ways, and we hope that you are taking care of yourselves and that you and your loved ones are healthy and safe. Like everyone, ACYPL is adapting to the times, and while the format of our work has changed, we remain committed to our mission of connecting political leaders and change makers across the United States and around the world to address the many challenges we're all facing. So, until it's safe to resume our work as we know it, we look forward to seeing you on a regular basis through our virtual town hall series. We're also planning to launch additional virtual programming, so if you're not already, please follow us at ACYPL on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram for updates, and keep an eye out for emails from us. Now, I am thrilled to introduce ACYPL alumni Dave Christman, Vice President of State Affairs at the National Beer Wholesalers Association, and Dawson Hobbs, Senior Vice President of Government Affairs at Wine and Spirits Wholesalers of America. Dawson and Dave are here to discuss the many impacts of COVID-19 on the alcohol industry, the economic outlook, and what the future of the industry could look like. Dawson, with that, I'll kick it over to you to talk a little bit about your work at WSWA, and then to Dave to discuss NBWA and the work he's doing there.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to be here. I hope that everybody enjoys what we have to discuss here today. As she said, I'm Dawson Hobbs, the Senior Vice President of Government Affairs at WSWA. WSWA represents the nation's wine and spirits distributors. We're the ones that buy it from the producers and sell it to retailers. And collectively, our members distribute about 80% of the wine and spirits sold in the United States today. This has been an interesting time for them, and we'll talk about some of those details in a few minutes. But I thank everybody for coming and hope you enjoy it. Dave?
Great, thanks, Dawson, and thanks, Jacqueline and ACYPL for putting this together. I think we've all become far more proficient than we ever thought we would at Zoom and GoToMeeting and WebEx and whatever your webcasting service of choice happens to be. My name is Dave Christman. I'm head of state affairs for the National Beer Wholesalers Association. State affairs, I think, is essentially important when it comes to the alcohol industry. Always a good reminder that when the 21st Amendment to the Constitution was passed, yes, it ended prohibition, but Section 2 of that amendment left each state with regulatory control of the alcohol policies within. So that's why, seldom do we have one answer from a national level as far as, alcohol policies or regulations. Every state treats it very differently, has different laws, different policies in place, and hopefully we'll make some sense of that here today. My members are very similar to Dawson's. I represent the beer distributors across the country, a little more than 3,000 independent businesses, more than 140,000 employees across the country, good living wage, career type jobs, and folks that have stayed open and kept the supply chain going for beer and all the other beverages that they distribute throughout this pandemic. I think we're going to go right into the slides next. So Christina, do you want to pull us up? All right, let's go right ahead to the next one. And even one, so as we put this program together, we figured what we'd do is start by sharing some facts and figures from the industry, kind of give you a landscape of where we are and what we've seen through this pandemic. And then we'll get in a little bit more to some of the policy questions and what our trade associations have been doing. So this chart in front of you, this is one of the favorite charts that we keep at MBWA. We have a partner company by the name of FinTech that every week processes more than a quarter of the beer transactions across the country. And so each week we can see sort of what the beer sales look like, compared to previous years for that week. And it sort of looks like a seismograph or something like that. But, it shows you, as you look through the year, sort of the big beer occasions. Memorial Day, 4th of July, Labor Day are obviously huge for our industry. You see that Super Bowl spike at the start of the year. You see the benefit of the holidays. But as we start today, I did want to start with a little bit of fun. And I told Jacqueline and Dawson on our prep call yesterday that I was going to give them a little trivia question to start. So if you see that red circle right around week 38, 39, that's in 2018. And, I'm going to ask you guys to kind of go backwards in time because we saw this spike somewhat unexpectedly back, and this is about the first week of September as the calendar goes. And, our economist on staff, he and I met, a few months later and said, gosh, what event did we miss in early September of this year that resulted in a pretty sizable spike for beer industry volumes across the country? And Dawson, Jacqueline, any guesses what may have accounted for that spike in beer sales?
Dawson, I'm going to follow your lead on this one.
I'm not sure I can remember back that far.
So and I've shared this with a few groups that the first answer I usually get is, well, it's the start of football season, right? So NFL, college football, but every year, early September is the start of football season. And while we might see a little bit of a surge, we haven't seen a spike like that. But what we did see the first week of September in 2018, and politics aside here, but it was the confirmation hearings of Justice Kavanaugh. And you'll remember Justice Kavanaugh, I think famously 41 times throughout his several days of hearings, talked about his enjoyment of drinking beer, and media repeatedly shared those clips. And so within the industry, we call that the Kavanaugh bump that the beer industry experienced in 2018. Jokes aside, again, I kind of want to get back to the red line of this graph, though, and focus on what we've seen from the beer industry side as this pandemic went underway. Right around week 10, 11 is when we started to see some stay-at-home orders, and somewhat fortunate for our industry, you did see a short-term big old spike. The same time everyone was rushing to the grocery store to get toilet papers and bread and milk and whatever other essential items they thought they needed. We were fortunate that, they did put beer in that same shopping basket. And in the short term, we saw a nice spike in sales, and, it was certainly good for our members' businesses. But as quickly as that hit, you saw it come right back down. And as, the economic, uncertainty set in and joblessness rose, you see those numbers dip pretty low. But if we can go to the next slide, as a result of that one big week, we did see a lot of headlines like this, and still seldom a day goes by that somebody doesn't say to me, well, the alcohol industry seems to be doing quite well through this pandemic, and people are drinking more than ever, and everybody's doing virtual happy hours, and you name it. Lucky for you to be in an industry that hasn't been negatively impacted. I think now Dawson and I are going to kind of share the rest of that story. And again, while we did have a short-term boom, we certainly have not, we've certainly felt this pandemic, and a lot of folks in our industry have felt a lot of pain. And so I think we do want to kind of share the rest of that story. Dawson, why don't you start with the next slide?
Yeah, so what you can see here is our graph from our data project that we do, which tracks the what we call depletion, which are essentially the sales from distributors to retailers. And we track this in what we call two channels, the on and off premise. So off premise would be what you think of as a grocery store, a package store, a liquor store, where you're buying it to take home. And on premise, which is about 25% of the market for wine and spirits, is your bars, your restaurants, sporting venues, concert arenas, those types of things. And if you look at that blue line there, this data is only for the first quarter of the year. So it only captures the first 2 weeks of the shutdown. And you can see the drop in sales during quarter one in the on-premise. And that's just from 2 weeks of the shutdown. As we've gone through all of April now and all of May, we expect that blue line of on-premise sales to remain at that low level. And this is challenging for the wine and spirits industry for obviously a couple of reasons. First is there's simply no activity in the on-premise, but the on-premise is very important to us because those are products, frankly, that tend to be higher value products. People tend to spend more on products they buy at bars and restaurants than they do what they buy at the grocery store or liquor store. And also for us, on-premise is where we launch and build brands. We introduce new products in bars and restaurants and get people interested in them and then hope to convert them to buy them for at-home consumption later on. So we now have had 2.5 months in the spring, which would normally be when we'd be launching brands for the year and for the summer, where there hasn't been that brand launch. And so this is going to have a real long-term impact on the wine and spirits side of the industry. What's really concerning is thinking about how long it'll take those bars and restaurants to get back up and going once all the stay-at-home orders are lifted, because it won't be like flipping a switch. It's going to be a long, slow climb. Next slide.
Let's go ahead and move on. So, you know, very similar to what Dawson just said, and what you see in front of you here, this is literally a count of all of the retail outlets that sell beer across the entire country. And you know, while there hasn't been a drastic amount of closures yet, you know, you see, you know, here in May, 629,000 total beer selling accounts. When mid-March came, you know, that area you see shaded essentially went away. The dinings, you know, the restaurants, the bars, recreation, think of all the concert venues, the ballparks, the stadiums, the Top Golf that you go to on the weekend. You know, all of these places are crucial beer selling accounts. And, you know, for a lot of the same reasons Dawson just said, this is, you know, where consumers might try something new, be introduced to a new brand. Certainly the spring is when you're seeing new product launches and you know, when people are getting ready for that big summer season. So, you know, to almost overnight have nearly 400,000 on-premise locations, beer selling locations across the country close their doors was certainly a major shock to the whole industry. Next slide. Sorry, I just saw the question pop up of what is a category killer? Category killer is kind of like a Dollar General, Family Dollar type store. Some of the deep discount retailers that have gotten into the beer space. So good question. So you know, these pie charts here just show even more what I was sharing. Typically on the beer side, you know, through the spring months, you'll see anywhere from that 13 to 16% is what is that on-premise business versus off-premise, which is the grocery, convenience, big box, things like that. As normally, as you get into the warmer months, that number grows even a little bit more as more people are going out, going to bars and restaurants. But you see what happened here in 2020, down to, you know, 2%. And, you know, that's essentially, you know, growlers to go and you know, some to go sales from some of these establishments. But, you know, almost overnight, you saw such a drastic change in consumers in that on versus off premise channels. Next slide. And you know, this just kind of tells it a different way, but you know, certainly there have been winners as a result of this. You know, we've seen increased grocery sales in the beer channels. We've seen convenience go up a little bit, liquor stores, but you know, it hasn't been new volume entering the industry. It's been that shift from the right side of this chart, which is the bars and restaurants essentially going down close to zero, and those volumes being made up by those different off-premise outlets. Let's keep going to the next. So a little more specific to the beer industry is what we call the package mix. And, you know, again, on the left side, you're going to see this is pretty typical to what the beer industry looks like most of the time, where you have, you know, 57% cans, 31% bottles, and usually somewhere in that 9 to 10% is the amount of draft beer that's consumed, you know, that's bought by consumers. Again, post-lockdown, you see this number is down to 0.5%. And again, that might be a few people with a kegerator at home and a few people getting growler fills to go from establishments that are open. But, almost overnight, all of those on-premise establishments I showed you, that's the life of draft beer. You almost saw, keg beer and draft beer disappear overnight. Where do you drink a draft beer? You drink it at a bar, you drink it at a ball game, you have it with dinner at a restaurant, you have it at a brew pub or at a tap room. Suddenly none of those places, can be open to consumers. That's an entire category of our beer industry that lost its marketplace, again, essentially almost overnight. Go ahead to the next slide. So, that's led to, some of these headlines. And certainly since the very beginning of this has been a big concern for us. Not only did we see draft beer lose the occasion to consumers, draft beer and beer in general, different from some other products, is very perishable. A typical keg of beer, if it's kept cold, is generally good for somewhere in the 90-day range. The style of beer and the brewing process, can change that, and in some cases it can be extended, 120, even more than that. But think back to March, think back to mid-March, and think about it from the beer industry side of things. You had March Madness that was about to begin. You had the biggest on-premise beer holiday of the entire year in St. Patrick's Day that was canceled because this started just about 5 days before. You have people going on spring break. You have NBA and NHL playoffs about to begin. You have Major League Baseball opening day about to start. This was prime load-in time for draft beer. So whether it was already in retail accounts, whether it's sitting in distributors' warehouses, or whether the brewers were still producing it, this was ramp-up season for draft beer. And all of a sudden, not only can this beer not be consumed, but the clock is ticking on whether or not it's going to go bad. Next slide, Dawson, I think this is yours.
Dave, could I ask a quick question before we move forward? I wonder if you could speak to what happened to the abandoned alcohol that was initially intended, to be served in these large entertainment venues, restaurants, bars, all of which, as you said, were essentially closed overnight. Was the majority repurposed or thrown away? Or if it was thrown away, do you have a sense of how much of what was produced was lost?
So I think many in our industry have learned more about this than we ever thought we would. You really can't repurpose keg beer. Once it's in there, you don't take it back to the brewery and suddenly put it into cans or bottles. So in most cases, my members, where they could, were going into these accounts, taking back the product. At that point, you can't dump it down a drain. You have to do what's called decanting the keg. And again, I wouldn't have been able to tell you this 3 months ago, but there's an environmental impact to simply dumping this beer. So you have to somewhat professionally be able to have this decanted. A lot of the breweries prefer it be decanted before it's shipped back to them, simply because a keg of beer is 160 or so pounds, and shipping it, this is intended to be a one-way street. I had some of my distributor members point out, a lot of bars, the kegs are tapped in the basement, underground, and it's a lot easier to take that keg of beer down the stairs than it is to take it back up when it's still full. So the answer is a little bit of everything. Thankfully it hasn't all coated out yet, as we're starting to see some slow reopening. Some of this beer may still be able to be consumed, but we've seen, thankfully, brewers step up and offer at least a cost share with a lot of the distributors on sort of eating the cost of this. We are considering some federal action around maybe a tax credit of sort for the product that's spoiled as a result of this pandemic. But no, there have been a lot of creative uses, and I know we'll get to it. The last and probably most beneficial use of some of this keg beer has been being able to donate it to distillers as they've been making hand sanitizer. Beer is not high enough alcohol content to make hand sanitizer, but as I understand it, it saves that distiller a few days or several days in their distilling process to get it up to the proper alcohol level it needs to be.
Thank you.
So we're pretty fortunate on the wine and spirit side. Not as many of our products are perishable. Interestingly, box wine is, while bottled wine is not. But that's mainly an off-premise product. I mean, there's a few bars that use box wine as their house wine. So the perishability issue isn't as large for the wine and spirit side, but we do have a unique thing compared to beer, which is in 31 states, our members actually sell on credit. They extend credit to retailers, usually with a term of 30 days. And as retailers operate on thin cash flow margins, they usually go right to the end of that 30 days before paying their bills. So when this shut down, all the products that had been sold in the previous 2 to 4 weeks had not yet been paid for to the distributors. And as you can see here, that totals a little over $900 million nationally. And it's something that our members think is unlikely that they will collect most of those receivables. And that has a ripple effect because it affects our members' cash flow and really creates a credit crunch on their ability to keep products flowing through the supply chain. So that's one of the real challenges we're facing on the wine and spirit side. You can go next slide.
So this is the last of our kind of facts and figures slide, and it's one that you see we've been probably using for about 20 years. But you know, as we kind of shift into talking policy and talking regulation and everything else, you know, we think it's important to realize that this chart represents the amount of pure alcohol that consumers drink per capita on average year over year over year. So with all the new breweries and wineries and distillers, all the new retail outlets, all the changes we've seen in the last 20 years across the alcohol industry, what hasn't changed is per capita consumption is about 2.5 gallons of pure alcohol per consumer per year. And, you know, there are huge fights, you know, within the beer industry between, you know, craft and domestic and import. There's fights between the segments, between beer, wine, and liquor. You know, lots of competition within the industry, but consumption is pretty predictable. And you know, sometimes, you know, we often hear words like economic development and we're going to create this or do that. But, you know, what we've seen, again, looking at least these 20 years is, you know, generally when a new sale happens here, it's usually not a new sale. It's usually a sale that's being taken away from over here. So we'll kind of, you know, let that sink in as we start to talk about some of the policy and regulatory changes we've seen. Next slide. We can keep on going. Next slide. Yep. Dawson, do you want to start from the federal side of kind of some of the changes we've seen?
Yeah, if you could go back one slide. So on the federal side, when the shutdowns began in mid-March, there was a lot of unknowns. And one of the most important things was trying to understand who was going to be allowed to remain open. So we, along with, I believe, NBWA and a lot of other organizations in town, engaged the federal government on their essential designation guidance and worked with the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Administration to ensure that the supply chain was included in part of the essential designations. We also worked with our regulator, our primary regulator, the Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau, TTB, to get guidance around things like the ability to pick up product from accounts that are closed. Normally, we cannot accept products back from a restaurant, bar, package store. And there's a lot of good reasons for that, right? One of them is that you want to make sure the product is the same product, that hasn't been tampered with. But also it's about maintaining the independence of those retailers and not allowing consignment sales where a producer or distributor would try and force retailers to take things they don't want. We did get guidance from TTB about picking up those products and returning them. Also about, as Dave said, you know, what to do with product that it needs to be disposed of. information about what we could do to help our retailer partners in terms of donating to charities that might help their employees. And then also what we could do to have some flexibility within the retail credit terms. And lastly, TTB did take a lot of steps to help, especially the distillers, in having guidelines of how they could use their equipment to manufacture hand sanitizer.
A quick
Yeah,
question.
Go
ahead, Dave. I was going to say,
I'll go. The only thing I'd add, Dawson, is, you know, a lot of times we you know, like to maybe be critical of regulators or you know, of their timeline. As this thing got going in March, TTB was incredibly responsive at the federal level. You know, that guidance around product pickup took about 24 hours for them to put something out. And, you know, with our guys uncertain what they could do and not wanting this to come across as a consignment sale or something like that, it was awfully nice to have quick guidance that we could share with our members to let them get right to work. Go ahead, Jacqueline.
I was just going to ask, you know, there's a high demand for hand sanitizer right now. I don't think I've been able to buy any since March, but I wonder if you could speak to how your members have transitioned or are now producing sanitizer. Was that infrastructure in place before COVID-19, or was it born a bit more out of necessity? And, you know, in that same question, is the focus there more on production, or is it production and distribution?
So our members are helping in the distribution of it, mainly partnering with their distillers partners who are producing it. It's interesting. So a distiller, anybody that makes spirits, that infrastructure can make the alcohol that's needed for hand sanitizer. It's simply making a type of alcohol, which is one of the components for the hand sanitizer. What the hang up was really, and this is where FDA was not as responsive as TTB, is the law says, FDA regs say that to be hand sanitizer, it has to be made with denatured alcohol. And that just means that it has something added to it to make it not drinkable. So it basically is a super bittering agent that makes it unpalatable. And the problem is, once you put that into the distillation system, it's very hard to get out. So it makes that system really unsuitable for making then drinkable alcohol later on. And FDA was not very flexible in their willingness to allow the hand sanitizer to be made with non-denatured alcohol. And there's reasons for that. You know, they were concerned about people consuming it, especially underage folks, but even distillers who were saying we can label it and only sell it to hospitals and first responders, medical folks. But FDA was pretty slow on coming around to giving any guidance on that. Congress did act in the COVID relief bill to make sure that there was no excise tax due on alcohol that was used in hand sanitizer, which I think was a pretty good move on their part. Certainly made it easier for the distillers to manufacture that hand sanitizer. But they certainly have been doing it. I would also say, interestingly, we've heard anecdotal stories of some very high-proof products being used to sterilize ambulances and those types of things, just because of its high alcoholic nature. And I know that the local ABC store here in Virginia has refilled their hand sanitizer pumps with a high-proof alcohol product. When you check out, you're actually spritzing your hand with their hand sanitizer pump with a sort of an Everclear type product, which is kind of creative.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you.
Yeah, and you know, from our side, it's similar. Really, the first week of this pandemic, I got a call from Washington State, and it was, you know, that's really where we saw the first big breakout in the States. And a hospital system there had reached out to some of our members, and they'd identified a local distiller who, you know, was willing to turn over their production to start making this hand sanitizer. And, you know, the call I got was, is this permissible? What do we need to do? How do we need to make this work? And you know, since then, I think the process has gotten, you know, a lot more streamlined. We've seen it across the country. Like I mentioned, our guys love, as we have beer that goes out of code, rather than having to decant it or figure out what to do with it, if we can donate it to these distillers to speed up the process and get this sanitizer into the market quicker, I think it's been a win-win for everybody. And in the beginning, most of our guys were focused on, and I think most of these distillers were focused on donating it to those who needed it. Now we've started to see a little bit more of a commercial market for it. And I know I've been to a few stores that, a repurposed, whiskey bottle is now what's used for sanitizer. So it's been kind of fun to watch.
Got it.
All right. Like I said in the beginning, each state obviously has control, and even a lot of local jurisdictions have control about, who can sell what, when, and how. And as a result of this pandemic, we've seen a lot of, relief efforts at the state level. I would say primarily what we've seen is the sort of retail to consumer transaction, whatever orders could be put into place to help these terribly impacted bars and restaurants that couldn't open their doors to people anymore, and we're still trying to stay afloat. So you see here, curbside pickup, to-go sales of beer, wine, cocktails. There's certainly questions within those categories. Does it have to be prepackaged? Is it something they can pour or prepare on premises and then sell it? Local delivery, we've seen, some people attempting to, take that bartender from behind the bar and put them in a vehicle to do local deliveries of some of these products, and some increased e-commerce opportunities. I think during this pandemic, certainly this all makes sense. Extension of license renewals, we can talk about that as well. This is essentially if your license was up May 1st, state regulatory agencies weren't going to make you go through that process of going through a license renewal right now. Extend it 3 months or 6 months, and get to that process. Once things hopefully return to some sense of normal. Dawson and I both mentioned the credit terms extension. Beer in more states does not offer credit, or has maybe 7 or 15-day credit. We have seen a number of states that again, understandably, for some of these shuttered on-premise businesses, have extended those terms, 30, 60, however many days to try to help these guys out. We've seen some groups calling for a deferral of their tax payments. That's not really been a primary focus of ours. There's a lot of money going out. We know there's a need for revenue when it comes to alcohol as well. And at least at this point in time, thankfully our members have still been able to pay those excise taxes that are due. And then, like we said, at the federal level, they clarified product returns, but there are a number of states that have specific guidelines on that as well. And so once again, you don't want to risk a consignment sale or risk taking back a product that the state or a regulator thinks that you shouldn't be able to do. So seeking that guidance, getting that clarification, so you can go in and take back that product. And if it's packaged product like cans or bottles, you might be able to resell it into an account that is still open and is still selling this product.
Quick question.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of interest in the space of relief efforts for impacted bars and restaurants. And I'd like to pose a question which was submitted by a state senator. And he writes, I live in I live in a control state, Utah, and have seen the impact firsthand as a restaurant owner. I've reopened for takeout and delivery, but many friends in the local food and beverage industry operate bars or lounges. Many are still unable to open safely, and even if they are open, they are unable to generate any revenue. As a state senator, how can I support this industry with policy? And do you have any ideas about how to advocate for the cocktail bar lounge side of the service industry?
Yeah, so we think, and one of the things we did right at the beginning of the shutdown is we did write to all 50 governors and attorneys general and the alcohol regulator in each state, advocating that during this time, they should allow curbside pickup and to-go and delivery of products from on and off-premise retailers. Trying to maintain some ability to generate revenue. I think both those curbside to-go or delivery options for a bar or restaurant are critical. One of the things we're also doing federally, just as WSWA, is we are advocating for Congress to reinstate the full deduction for meals and entertainment, so that when restaurants do reopen, that businesses and hopefully some of that business activity will be encouraged to return and spend money in bars and restaurants. But that's obviously a more forward-looking thing. And the immediate, I think, is just providing options for your bars to do some sort of revenue through a to-go or takeout means. I would say going forward, and we'll talk about this a little bit, we need to be very thoughtful about how that's structured and to make sure that we don't open a can of unintended consequences because of those to-go or delivery sales.
Yeah, I'd simply echo what Dawson said. And for those businesses, it's figuring out what you want your business model to look like as you hopefully reopen. And if you're going to be in the to-go alcohol space, there's probably a convenience or a package store up the street that you're going to be, competing with. And so, trying to level that playing field, whether there's lots of different pricing laws and regulations that you could look at, a quantity discount ban, something like that. But, I think the first decision for those bars and restaurants is, is this the business they want to be in once they can reopen? Or, I've had somebody share with me that it's been a good morale boost for them to, be able to deliver some product locally, but it's not really been a revenue generator or, something that they see as a long-term moneymaker for their business. So, the first thing is figuring out what you want to do. Let's go to the next slide. So, just a couple of slides of, what's next. Most of these changes that we've kind of highlighted here, and again, each state has been super unique, but very few of these have been legislative changes. Most of these are privileges that have been granted attached to some emergency order. So, as those emergency declarations come to an end, those privileges will be set to expire. That said, we know, we've seen a lot of advocacy already. I'm certain we're going to see a lot more of different interest groups and advocacy groups that want to see permanency behind some of these changes. As Dawson said, this is not going to be a light switch that goes back on, that suddenly, that every consumer is back into these establishments and they're, back to February 2020 levels. So, I think, this is the start of a lot of these debates.
Yeah, and I would say that this is the time for policymakers to sit and think about what it should look like going forward. There will be situations where people got used to ordering a bottle of wine with their takeout food or a six-pack of beer or whatever it may be, and some consumers are going to want to continue that. I can tell you that we are working on drafting guidelines to help states deal with this issue going forward, so that, for instance, a to-go cocktail is not something somebody can just take sips from in the car on the drive home, and make sure that we maintain the good progress we've made on reducing impaired driving, on reducing underage access, to make sure that there's guidelines that anybody doing a delivery is going to check IDs just like it would be done in a bar or a package store.
Before we move to the next slide, there is, you probably won't be surprised, there are lots of questions along the lines of curbside pickup, of alcohol to go, beer, wine, cocktails, and seeing as this is of significant interest among the audience, I'd like to briefly weigh some of the pros and cons of some of these new policies in place, and what challenges may be posed in the future. So to start that discussion, one alum wrote in saying, alcohol to go has been initiated or extended in many states during COVID-19. Is this trend here to stay, or will states roll back these relaxed rules? If life after, or excuse me, in life after COVID, how do you think cities and states will address relaxed enforcement of open container laws? And finally, what about restaurants selling cocktails mixed in-house versus kits of mixers and mini liquor bottles?
MBWA is I don't think anyone should talk about post. We can't wait for whatever post looks like. It's figuring out what life with COVID looks like. Going back to that 2.5 gallon per person chart, I think one of those questions around to go is, whose impact is on the other end? And, there are a lot of states where an off-premise liquor license holds a lot of value and is something that a lot of small independent businesses, count on for their livelihood. And so, if they have new competitors up and down the street who can also enjoy the same privilege of selling alcohol to go, it's probably going to negatively impact their business. That's not necessarily a reason not to do it, but, I think that's why we say, this is for the legislature, this is for, every stakeholder to weigh in and kind of understand, what makes the most sense. From the cocktail side, I think we're in a lot of ways going to see the market figure this out. We do a big trade show at MBWA each year, and last year I probably saw 20 different companies that are expanding the cocktails in a can, or the ready to drink cocktails that you can purchase on or off premise, and so I think we're going to see a growth in that category, and it doesn't mean people won't make that mixed drink behind the bar and sell it to go, but I think you're going to see some creative manufacturers out there try to fill some of this void.
Yeah, and I think there's already starting to be some solutions for the cocktail mix behind the bar. I know Pennsylvania, for instance, has a bill that requires it to be sealed with either wax or shrink wrap, heat shrink wrap that you can heat up with a hair dryer. And that sort of satisfies that open container rule in the sense that it's a sealed top that once it's opened can't be resealed. So a law enforcement officer that sees that is going to readily see that somebody is violating the open container law, be it on the sidewalk or in their car. I think that the consumer is going to really drive some of this, and they're going to demand more of these options. And I think that the market will find more solutions. I think we'll see new packaging and new containers developed that specifically for to-go, specifically for delivery. I think one of the issues that does need to be addressed is the third-party delivery concept, the if you will, the Uber Eats, Grubhub, where it's not an employee of the store, of the restaurant. None of us would accept a drink from a stranger, but we will somehow accept food delivered by a stranger. And when that person's not an employee of the restaurant, are they held to the same standards as the restaurant? And that's why we think that anybody that's involved in this, any third party, should have to have some sort of a license so that they can be held to the same standard of making sure that they check IDs, that they don't tamper with the product, that they're accountable to the regulators just like a liquor store or a restaurant would be.
Let's go ahead to the next slide. These are just a few of the additional questions to consider, and I don't even know, Jacqueline, you're doing a good job kind of hitting us with questions. I don't know that we need to go through each of these individually, but again, I'd point to the last one though and say business is going to return slowly. If you're a bar or a restaurant that's been closed and now you can open at 25% capacity, or you can open with just outdoor seating, you're probably still not profitable. And even if that goes to 50, even if that eventually gets to 100, we don't know where the consumer is. We don't know how quickly people are going to rush back into these establishments and again, return to whatever we think normal is. So, I think certainly as we're considering all of these policy challenges and you know, most importantly, hoping these businesses survive, you know, we're not going to be able to on September 1st to kind of wash our hands of this and say, okay, things are open again, these guys are good. You know, this is going to be a long-term challenge.
I would agree with that. In talking to the restaurant associations and talking to our members, the consensus is that from the time that restaurants can reopen at 100%, it's probably 2 years before they get to the same place they were in December of 2019. The loss in overall restaurants that probably won't reopen or that will reopen and not make it is going to be significant. And it's going to be a long time before people want to invest back in those businesses again. And so it's going to be a slow road.
Let's go ahead to the next slides. And one more. I know we want to get to some more questions at the end, so but I do want a quick run through just you know, in a lot of ways, you know, from the start of this pandemic, you know, we said at MBWA, like, this is why people write a dues check to be a part of MBWA. Like, you know, times like this are when, you know, being a trade association matters, and you know, really when we earn our keep in a lot of ways. So you know, from our side, we've focused on 4 things since March. We talked a little first about, you know, the federal and state essential designations. You know, I think we were very early to the party on that, and we didn't seek out beer, we didn't seek out alcohol. We sought out what it is our guys do. So, you know, if you look at that FEMA and DHS guidance, you know, it's transportation and logistics, and it's food and beverage and the distribution of it. You know, our members, while they primarily are beer distributors, they carry lots of bottled waters and juices and energy drinks and other products like that. We spend a lot of time educating people about, you know, the importance of what our guys do, and that, you know, we didn't see news stories about empty shelves of beer or empty shelves of, you know, energy drinks like we did toilet paper. And so, you know, we wanted to talk about the value our guys provide. Product flexibility, again, we talked about the ability to move product around, the ability to take product out of closed retailers and hopefully repurpose it. Honestly, for us, the biggest thing we've done is that number 3, employee protection and best practice sharing. I think every day for 50 days, we have sent something out to our membership with new best practices around communicating with your retailers, how to have a contactless transaction, how to sanitize a beer truck or a warehouse floor, what to do if you have an employee who's been infected, you know, all of these things that none of our members have ever thought about. You know, we talked to people in the most impacted cities, you know, people in Manhattan, people in Seattle, people in Michigan, got their best practices and shared them with our entire membership, literally on a daily basis of, you know, this is what you need to be thinking next. This is the plans you need to have in place. And you know, I think, you know, we've gotten great response from our members. You know, we built a website around it, and you know, I think it provided a lot of good. And last for us, you know, is focusing now on relief and recovery. You know, how do we keep obviously our members operating and working safely, but, you know, how can they help reopen their markets? How can they help these bars and restaurants as they reopen their doors for the first time in 11 weeks? And what does this reopening look like, and how can we help? So that's been our focus now, and you know, I think will stay our focus here for the next few weeks. Dawson, how about you guys?
Yeah, next slide. A lot of the same things. We from the beginning worked on the essential designations. You know, and much like NBWA, I think we cooperated on a lot of this, which was, you know, focusing on the supply chain for the food and beverage industry and making sure that was able to keep functioning. Working on employee safety, you know, getting information to our members, whether it was from state health organizations or the CDC or others, make sure they could safely operate their business. As we go forward, you know, as I said, we're working to try and help our restaurant partners get back on their feet. We have a provision that we're working on at the federal level and trying to let us write off all that bad debt that I mentioned earlier. That'll be very helpful because it means that we will be able to move forward and get help new restaurants get back on their feet by really focusing on what's coming in the future. And then we've been also, one thing that I didn't mention, working at the federal level on tariff relief. We have, in the last year, had tariffs imposed on a lot of imported products, both spirits and wine coming from Europe. And in this particular time, with cash flow being an issue, paying those tariffs is a significant burden on our ability to bring those products to market. So we've been trying to get some temporary suspension of that tariff relief as we transition from sort of the beginning of the crisis to this, as Dave said, living with COVID sort of environment.
Great. Next slide. And you know, to end our slides, I think we each have a few of these, but you know, I'd be remiss if I didn't say, you know, you walk out of this and you know, I love that I feel so much better about the people I've worked for the last 19 years. You know, everybody's life changed in March, and not seeing just our guys, you know, keep rolling trucks and delivering beer, but seeing everything they've done in their communities as you know, kind of reinvigorated us even at the staff level. Every day we see different social media or different news stories about our guys. You know, just a few examples here, you know, donating refrigerated trucks to a local food bank or to school lunch programs that are delivering, you know, setting up so that people can come pick up a school lunch. We usually try not to have those trucks wrapped with beer signage at the school lunch ones, but, you know, donating equipment. We talked about donating beer to make hand sanitizer. You know, we've seen that happen across the country. Next slide. Just the amount of donations of product, you know, taking pallets of, you know, bottled waters or juices to testing sites, to, you know, frontline workers, to law enforcement, you name it, you know, just doing whatever they can in their community to make a difference and to help out. And then we've mentioned it a few times, but supporting these bar and restaurant workers that, you know, rely on, you know, tips and daily wages to get by. And so, you know, I don't know that there isn't a community that hasn't set up relief funds where, you know, we're donating money, we're donating whatever we can to help these, you know, workers who have been the most impacted and you know, obviously who can't wait to get back behind the bar and get back to what they do. So again, a little gratuitous, but you know, certainly it's easy to focus on the negative through this pandemic, but a lot of people are doing a lot of good things too. Next slide.
Yeah, same thing on our side, Dave. It is, you know, really, our members are really focused on trying to help the restaurant and bar folks that have taken the brunt of this. They're also donating supplies, as you said, in some cases, whether it's products, bottled water, or also just trying to, in many cases, just cash to try and put into relief efforts to help the folks that are really suffering the most. The other thing they're trying to do is really take care of their employees. This has not been, as we saw earlier with the loss of on-premise sales, this has not been easy for our member companies financially. And so, but they've still done things. Some of our companies have introduced what they call hero pay, which is bonuses for the workers that have to go out and interact with the retailers and are most at risk. Also, trying to take every measure they can to help workers who really don't have anything to do because their customers are closed, finding other things for them to do rather than having to furlough them or have them go without pay. A lot of our sales folks operate on commission, and when all their customers were closed, they obviously weren't going to earn any commission, and a number of our members took steps to try and make sure that they didn't suffer and that they still got paid, at least so far through this crisis.
I think that is it for slides.
Any other questions?
Right?
I have one that I see that was submitted by a member of the audience that I'd like to ask. Are there any policies implemented by local officials that have been particularly helpful during all of this?
So the jury's maybe still out on how helpful it's going to be, but just this week I saw in Colorado, who is getting ready to reopen, they have called, and I think it was the governor, so maybe it's a little more statewide, but they've called on local residents that may live in close proximity to a bar or restaurant to consider offering some of their front lawn space for outdoor seating. You know, Colorado's gone to patio and outdoor seating to start. So, you know, saying, you know, what can we do to expand the amount of outdoor seating options for these bars and restaurants as they reopen? And, you know, if you live close by, you know, considering offering up space, again, I could probably make an argument both ways on that, but it's certainly unique, if nothing else.
I would say the biggest thing is just recognizing that this is unique and being flexible and agile. And I think also being clear that these measures are temporary, and that when we return to a more long-term status, that everything needs to be re-examined and see what worked and what didn't.
Well, I see that we are quickly coming up on the hour. I don't know how it went by so quickly, but I think I'd like to close it by asking, with summer upon us and the weekend almost here, and without asking you to pick favorites, if you have any easy to make or go-to seasonal cocktails, beer, wine, that you might recommend for our folks to enjoy.
Well, actually, we just hosted our first of a series of mixology classes that we're offering online last week, and where one of our company mixologists taught me how to make a Negroni, which turns out to be a quite nice, refreshing summer cocktail. It went pretty well with my backyard barbecue over the weekend, and that's actually available on our website. And I'll make sure Jacqueline gets the link and can send it out to everybody if they want to see it, and we'll also let them send out when we do the next one at the end of June, if anybody would like to participate.
And from my side, you know, you saw that first slide. It's summer months or beer drinking months, and you know, you might not be at the ball game, you may not even be out on the boat, but you know, it doesn't mean you can't crack open a cold one. And I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the continued growth of the seltzer segment. You know, whether I won't go into the individual brands, but there are plenty of different hard seltzers out there, and you know, this is about the third year that we're seeing just incredible growth from that segment of the industry, and you know, I think the summer months are the prime months to enjoy some of those as well.
Great. Well, with that, I think we are going to go ahead and conclude our first virtual town hall from ACYPL. So Dave and Dawson, thank you so much for your time and for sharing all of this helpful information. And thank you to everyone who tuned in. We look forward to seeing you again. You know, ACYPL will be hopefully hosting more of these in the future. And I hope you check out our social media and keep an eye out for emails from us moving forward. So thanks again, and take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Bye.